Now, we've seen the disastrous impact of a state that's riddled by corruption. It undermines economic growth, diminishes public trust, and hinders social progress. But have we actually tackled the issue? And I don't mean just talk about it, actually tackle it at its source. And are we at the point where we are now desensitized to the breakdown of ethical and legal principles and related institutions that are actually supposed to hold people accountable? Well, it's a loaded question. Let's get the thoughts of Chief Risk Advisor of the Institute of Risk Management. It's Mr. Christopher Palm making time for me this morning. And Christopher, when it comes to corruption, it's such a widespread issue in our country. I don't think most people know where to even start having a conversation, at least a meaningful one, to try and get on top of that. Where would you start?
Absolutely. Good morning, Gareth, and thank you allowing eNCA to share some thoughts around the risks associated with fraud and corruption. You may or may not know, we release annually a risk report for South Africa as the Institute of Risk Management. And for the last couple of years, the last 5 years, we've been talking about fraud and corruption. It escalated to continued fraud and corruption. Then it became a view as fraud and corruption embedded into the fabric of our public sector, our private sector. And currently we're at a point where we talk about systemic fraud and corruption. So I think it's very important to understand the difference. The difference being, this is not an individual. This is not maybe even a group of people that are falsifying signatures, these days digital signatures, that are falsifying source documents to solicit payments and that sort of thing. These are systems within your organization that have been corrupted from end to end. So when we talk about systemic fraud and corruption, it really becomes a challenge from the point of view the pervasiveness of the action that you have to taken or to be taken. So where do we start? I think as far as identifying the risk is, of course, the first port of call. Secondly, to integrate the strategy of your organization together with the risk, together with internal audit, external audit, your professional bodies looking at your system of internal control. That's just to get it on the radar. Absolutely, after that, one would want to be able to rely on your professional bodies to firstly have adequate, effective reporting, identification of the fraud, of course, making it presentable in court. And therein lies the challenge. Historically, we used to have focused legal systems for white-collar crime. People specialized in the prosecution of white-collar crime. And so, as we would have spoken in, with the earlier interview, of course, it is now necessary that we invoke those avenues for public and private sector to effectively attack fraud and corruption in our legal system.
And all of that having been said as well, do you sense, apart from the public and the private sector, I suppose more from a business and corporative perspective, do you think then the average South African has just become desensitized to corruption? I mean, here we are, we're talking about it, we cover it as media every day. I think people used to have a big interest in this, but off the back of the state capture inquiry, perhaps it just got a bit too much. Do you think we're desensitized to it? I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying I don't think South Africans necessarily are paying as much attention these days. We're desensitized and there's just so much of it. We don't know what to do with all this information.
Yeah, indeed, Gareth. I think the first thing is we don't really appreciate the impact of fraud and corruption on our daily lives, on the taxpayers' daily lives, on the way that grants are allocated, the amount of or the size of a grant that is allocated. So at a very basic level, I think we underestimate the impact of fraud and corruption. From a quality of service level, I think we are for sure a lot more acceptance around the level of service that we get impacted directly by fraud and corruption. And then, of course, the cost involved to prosecute or the cost involved to pursue and effectively address fraud and corruption is enormous. And so from that perspective, and also the effort and the commitment that goes into this, I think allows leadership to take a softer route out, an easier route out, as far as, or opposed to aggressively addressing fraud and corruption from a board level.
And I suppose I'm so glad you mentioned the word board, because I was just about to talk about the Eskom board as well. You mentioned how visceral some issues regarding corruption and fraud, etc., are being felt by regular South Africans. One of those is the issue I'm sure you and I are dealing with, along with everyone else, is the blackouts at the moment, currently stage 6 as well. From a risk perspective, where do you see us going into winter? Stage 8, do you think? Perhaps a grid collapse, because as we all know, widely reported now, that is as a result of years of mismanagement, financial malfeasance, corruption at Eskom, etc. I imagine it's right down your alley. How bad do you think it could get this year as a result of all of this corruption over the years? Last question to you, Christopher.
Yeah, eNCA is asked that question quite regularly. Do we think a blackout will occur? I need to be very specific. When we talk about a blackout, we talk about a national grid failure. So I think that's very important, because eNCA's view is that there are plenty clever people in Eskom at national control and across the whole platform that understands the impact of a national grid failure. And that would be a catastrophe for our country. So the likelihood, of course, is always there that there would be a national grid failure, but going into stages 6, 7, and 8, understanding that load shedding is actually a control. Load shedding is there to protect the system, and as pervasive and as extended as load shedding may become and hurt us tremendously, I think all of those manual and automated or system checks and balances that exist is to protect a national grid failure. So I think the winter will be challenging. I think the winter will extend load shedding, which of course will have a tremendous impact on our day-to-day lives. However, that will be done to protect the integrity of our national grid. So my view is that this is all about time. We have been mismanaging, as you earlier said, Gareth, for so long that time is not on our side to fix this immediately or in the short term even. So my view is, of course, that it will be tough. There will be a struggle. Of course, the risk, the likelihood of this risk materializing is, of course, increasing. But I still believe that the controls in place to prevent a national grid failure, fully understanding the impact that this will have, not just on South Africa, also on SADC, also on neighboring countries, will be tremendous. It would be unfathomable to think about that. And of course, for that reason, load shedding will continue, will get worse, will get longer, which will impact everything we do. And that was the piece we wrote to the risk fraternities, to say, go out there, understand what risk control strategies you've put in place from what we became used to as stage 4 and now going into stage 8. Will they still be effective?
And that's the question. Will they still be effective? And I'm very glad to hear your views on a grid collapse. It can't be a complete collapse, because it is, despite all of us not liking it, it is actually still somewhat under control. Christopher, thank you very much indeed. Chris Palm, Chief Risk Advisor at the Institute of Risk Management. Lots of information to think about as far as the various stage 8s, 7s and 6s we're in at the moment. But beyond that, of course, it goes back to the issue around corruption, doesn't it? My thanks to Chris Palm making time for us this morning.